Salem, Massachusetts, is a city that has never fully escaped its past. And honestly, it doesn't want to. But beyond the witch trials everyone knows about, there are layers of this place that don't make the tour guides. Here are the top 15 greatest unsolved mysteries of Salem, Massachusetts. Number 15. The true number of victims in the 1692 witch trials. Everyone knows the witch trials of 1692, but here is what most people don't know. The exact number of people who died as a direct result of them has never been definitively established. The official count cited most often is 25, 19 executed by hanging, 1 man pressed to death under stones, and 5 who died in prison awaiting trial. But historians have long argued that the prison death count is almost certainly higher. Salem's jails in 1692 were not hospitals or holding facilities with any medical oversight. They were cold, dark, overcrowded, and filthy. Prisoners were required to pay for their own food and accommodations, which meant those without resources went without. Some were shackled in iron, several died. How many of those deaths were directly attributable to their imprisonment, and how many were logged elsewhere or simply not recorded at all, is a question that primary sources cannot fully answer. The surviving court records are incomplete. Some were lost, some were deliberately destroyed, and some were never created in the first place because no one at the time thought it worth documenting the deaths of accused witches. The figure of 25 is likely a floor, not a ceiling. The full human cost of those 8 months has never been tallied. Number 14. The identity of the first accuser. The Salem witch trials are traditionally said to have begun when Betty Parris and Abigail Williams, the 9-year-old daughter and 11-year-old niece of Reverend Samuel Parris, began exhibiting strange behavior in January 1692. They screamed, contorted, complained of being bitten and pinched, and threw objects. The local physician, Dr. William Griggs, examined them and concluded their affliction was supernatural in origin, which, given the medical knowledge of the era, was not a particularly surprising diagnosis. But who made the very first formal accusation and why those 3 specific women were named is murkier than the history books suggest. The girls named Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne in February 1692. What drove that specific naming has never been conclusively established. Tituba was an enslaved woman whose exact origins remain disputed by historians, most likely indigenous, possibly Arawak, brought to Barbados before being acquired by Paris and transported to Massachusetts. The popular image of her as Caribbean, reinforced by Arthur Miller's The Crucible, is a fictionalization. She was, regardless of origin, a convenient and deeply vulnerable target. Sarah Good was a homeless beggar with a sharp tongue who was already unpopular. Sarah Osborne had not attended church in over a year and had a known land dispute with the Parris family. Whether the accusations were born of genuine fear, social coercion, family politics, or something else entirely has been debated for over 3 centuries. Tituba's confession, which she later recanted, helped launch the entire machinery of the trials. Why she confessed in such dramatic and detailed terms, whether under physical coercion, psychological pressure, or calculated self-preservation, is still not definitively known. Number 13. What actually happened to Giles Corey. Giles Corey is the only person in American history known to have been executed by pressing, a method called peine forte et dure, in which heavy stones are placed on a board laid over the body until the person either enters a plea or dies. Corey was 81 years old. He refused to enter a plea at his September 1692 proceedings, which under English common law meant the court could not formally try him. The pressing began on September 18, 1692. According to the account of Robert Califf, a contemporary observer, Corey asked for more weight. Over 2 agonizing days, more stones were added. He never entered a plea. He died on September 19, 1692. Califf's account states that at one point, Corey's tongue was forced from his mouth by the pressure, and the sheriff used his cane to push it back in. Corey's refusal to plead was a calculated legal move. By dying without a formal conviction, his estate could not be legally seized by the court and would pass to his heirs. The strategy worked. His property was protected. What remains unknown is exactly who ordered the pressing, under what specific legal authority it was carried out in a colonial Massachusetts context, and whether the sheriff who administered it faced any scrutiny afterward. No surviving record suggests he did. Number 12. The fate of Tituba after the trials. Tituba confessed to witchcraft in February 1692, delivering testimony so detailed and dramatic, describing a tall man from Boston who made her sign a book, describing familiars and Sabbaths and other accused witches, that it essentially confirmed for the court and community that something genuinely supernatural was happening in Salem. Her confession fueled the entire expansion of the trials. And then, when the hysteria ended and the courts began reversing course in late 1692 and 1693, she was simply left in jail. Unlike the accused who were acquitted or released, Tituba remained imprisoned because Reverend Samuel Parris refused to pay her jail fees, the costs that had to be settled before a prisoner could be released. She had already recanted her confession by this point, telling the court she had made it all up because Parris had beaten her and told her what to say. Parris denied this. She sat in a Boston jail for over a year after the trials effectively ended. At some point in 1693, an unidentified person paid her fees, and she was sold as an indentured servant to cover the debt. After that transaction, Tituba vanishes from all surviving historical records. Where she went, what name she used, whether she had children, and where she died, are questions that have no documented answers. She is one of the most consequential figures in American colonial history, and her life after 1693 is a complete blank. The woman whose testimony set 150 people on the path to imprisonment, and whose recantation nobody believed, disappeared into the colonial economy as just another indentured servant with no one keeping track of her name. History did not consider her worth following. The irony is that no single person did more to shape the Salem trials than Tituba, and no single person is harder to follow past the moment the trials ended. Number 11. The real cause of the accuser's afflictions. For over 300 years, historians, scientists, and medical researchers have debated what actually caused the young accusers in Salem to exhibit the symptoms they described: convulsions, visions, sensations of being bitten and pinched by invisible forces, inability to speak or move, and episodes of what witnesses described as trance-like states. The explanations that have been proposed include ergot poisoning from contaminated rye grain, encephalitis lethargica, Lyme disease transmitted by deer ticks, mass psychogenic illness, deliberate fraud for social or economic gain, and straightforward social contagion. The ergot theory, proposed by Linda Caporael in a 1976 paper in the journal Science, received significant scholarly attention and has also received significant criticism, most notably from psychologists Nicholas Spanos and Jack Gottlieb, who argued the symptom pattern did not match ergot poisoning, and that the social context was sufficient to explain the behavior. No single explanation has achieved consensus among researchers. The symptoms were apparently real enough to terrify the people experiencing them and the entire community around them. What caused them, whether biological, psychological, social, or some particularly unfortunate combination of all three, remains genuinely unsettled. It is worth noting that the community accepted a supernatural explanation within days. A century later, during the Age of Enlightenment, people looked back and found that embarrassing. Each subsequent generation has proposed the explanation that best fits its own framework. None has fully convinced everyone else. Number 10. The missing confession of Mary Warren. Mary Warren was a servant in the household of John and Elizabeth Proctor, and one of the original group of afflicted girls making accusations in 1692. In April of that year, she did something none of the other accusers did. She reversed course in open court, telling the magistrates that the afflicted girls were lying and that she herself had only pretended to be tormented. It was a moment of extraordinary courage, or perhaps clarity, in the middle of a communal panic. She was immediately accused of witchcraft herself. She was arrested, examined, and within days had recanted her recantation entirely. returning to the side of the accusers and eventually testifying against John Proctor, her own employer, who was later hanged. What happened in those few days between her first reversal and her return to the accusers is one of the most tantalizing gaps in the entire Salem record. The surviving examination transcripts are incomplete. Whether she was physically threatened, told she would hang if she did not cooperate, or simply broke under the psychological pressure of isolation and examination by authority figures is not documented. She went on to accuse dozens of people. She is one of the few accusers who briefly looked at what was happening and said it out loud, and then stopped saying it. What that experience cost her, and what she understood about herself afterward, is something the historical record cannot reach. Number 9. The location of the execution site. For over 300 years, the exact location where 19 people were hanged during the Salem witch trials was genuinely unknown or actively disputed. The traditional identification of Gallows Hill as the execution site had been accepted for generations, but the precise spot on that hill, a large rocky area that had been partially quarried and built over across 2 centuries, was a matter of ongoing historical debate. In 2016, a research team including historian Marilyn Roach and University of Virginia geography Professor Benjamin Ray applied a combination of historical maps, topographical analysis, period legal documents, and contemporary eyewitness accounts to systematically narrow the location. They identified Proctor's Ledge, a small rocky outcropping at the base of Gallows Hill near Boston Street, as the site where the hangings took place. The city of Salem officially accepted the identification. A permanent memorial was dedicated at the site on July 19, 2017, the 325th anniversary of the first 5 executions. What remains unresolved is whether any of the 19 executed individuals were buried at or near the site, and whether those remains, if they exist, are still there beneath what is now a quiet residential neighborhood. No archaeological excavation has ever been proposed or conducted. The memorial that stands there today marks the spot with the names of the 19 executed. It does not mark what may still be beneath the ground nearby, which is, in a way, exactly the kind of half-answer Salem has always given. The city is genuinely good at acknowledgement. It is less practiced at the harder work of full excavation, literal or otherwise. Number 8. The motives of Reverend Samuel Parris. Reverend Samuel Parris arrived in Salem Village in 1689 after an unsuccessful career as a merchant in Barbados, and his ministry was troubled from the start. He fought with his congregation over his salary, over who owned the parsonage he lived in, and over his unusually aggressive theological positions. He had real enemies in Salem Village before 1692. When his daughter and niece became the first accusers, he became not a concerned parent trying to protect his family, but the engine that drove the trials forward, recording confessions, pressing for more names, refusing to entertain doubt, and providing the court with testimony that helped convict his neighbors. A striking number of the people accused and executed had been on the wrong side of his various congregational disputes. Whether this was cynical opportunism, using a wave of hysteria to eliminate his enemies, or the behavior of a man who genuinely believed Salem Village was under satanic siege, has never been resolved. The surviving record is consistent with both interpretations, which is exactly the kind of ambiguity that has kept historians arguing for 3 centuries. He gave a partial public apology in 1694. It satisfied almost no one. He was forced out of his pulpit in 1697 and spent the rest of his life in relative obscurity. He never directly answered the question of whether he believed in the end that the trials had been just. That silence is its own kind of answer, though not a definitive one. The men who drove the trials, Parris, Hathorne, the other judges, mostly lived out the rest of their lives in Salem. They had to look at the families of the people they had killed. Most of them never said enough about that experience to satisfy anyone who has read about it since. Number 7. The Darby Wharf Smuggling Networks. Salem was one of the most important ports in early America, and by the late 18th century, it was sending ships to China, India, Sumatra, and the Pacific, at a pace that made it briefly one of the wealthiest cities per capita in the United States. The Darby family, Elias Haskett Darby in particular, became what is often cited as the first American millionaire through the China and East India trade. But the foundation of Salem's maritime wealth was built on decades of systematic violation of British trade law. The Navigation Acts required colonial trade to flow through English ports and English ships, paying English duties. Salem merchants violated these rules regularly, routinely, and creatively, as did merchants throughout colonial New England. The full scope of those smuggling networks, which captains were running, what goods through which unofficial channels, which customs officials were paid to look the other way, and how those practices were embedded in Salem's political and judicial structures during the colonial period, was never formally documented, partly because no one had an incentive to document it, and partly because the men who might have done so were the same men who were doing the smuggling. Some historians have argued that the economic resentments, land disputes, and power rivalries generated within Salem's merchant and farming classes contributed to the social fractures that made the 1692 hysteria possible. The specific causal link between those economic tensions and the witch trials has never been established from direct evidence, but the community that the trials tore apart was already deeply divided before the first accusation was made. Grievances about land, money, and power had been accumulating for years. The hysteria gave those grievances a supernatural vocabulary, and in 1692, that was a vocabulary everyone in Salem already spoke fluently. Number 6. The death of Dr. John Swinnerton. Dr. John Swinnerton was one of Salem's earliest and most respected physicians, practicing medicine in the town from the 1650s until his death in 1690, just 2 years before the trials erupted. He had deep roots in the community, had treated the illnesses of Salem families for decades, and would have known the medical histories of most of the people who became central figures in 1692. His medical records, to whatever extent they existed in a formal sense, did not survive. What he observed in his patients, what diagnoses he made, and whether any of the families whose children became accusers had histories of the kinds of nervous or convulsive disorders that would later be attributed to witchcraft is entirely undocumented. The physician who did examine Betty Paris and Abigail Williams in January 1692, Dr. William Griggs, concluded quickly and definitively that their affliction was supernatural. Swinnerton, who had far more experience in the community and with its families, might have arrived at a different conclusion, or might at least have taken longer to rule out other explanations. Whether his presence would have changed the course of events is speculation. What he saw and what he knew is simply gone with him. It is the kind of absence that history is full of. The records that were never kept, the observations that were never written down, the person who was not there at exactly the moment when their presence might have changed everything. Salem in 1692 had no shortage of those moments. A community of roughly 550 people in Salem Village, most of them related to each other by blood or marriage or long-standing grievance, decided in the space of 8 months that 150 of their neighbors were servants of the devil. The person who might have said "wait" the loudest was already 2 years in the ground. Number 5. The Charter Street Cemetery's unmarked dead. The Charter Street Cemetery in Salem, established in 1637, is one of the oldest surviving burying grounds in the United States and contains some of the most weathered and tilting headstones you will ever see. It holds the graves of several figures connected to the witch trials, including Judge John Hathorne, great-great-grandfather of the novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne, who reportedly added the W to his family name specifically to distance himself from his ancestors' role in the executions. What Charter Street does not contain, as far as anyone can determine, are the remains of any of the 19 people hanged in 1692. The executed were buried hastily and without ceremony, denied proper Christian burial as convicted witches, somewhere near the execution site at Proctor's Ledge. Their exact burial locations were never recorded in any document that has survived. Several families are known to have quietly retrieved the bodies of their relatives after the hysteria ended. Whether those retrieval attempts succeeded, whether the remains were moved to private family plots, and whether any of the 1692 dead are still somewhere beneath the houses and yards of the Gallows Hill neighborhood is a question that has never been answered, because no one has looked with the tools that might actually find them. ground-penetrating radar and forensic archaeology have located burial sites in far more complicated circumstances. The question of why it has not been applied at Proctor's Ledge is one that the city of Salem has not publicly answered. Perhaps the answer is complicated. Perhaps it is simple. Some things are easier left as memorials than as excavations. Number 4. The disappearance of Philip English. Philip English was one of the wealthiest merchants in Salem in 1692, a French-born trader whose birth name was Philippe Langlois, who had built a commercial empire that included 21 vessels, a wharf, multiple warehouses, and a grand house on Essex Street. He was also, by the standards of Puritan Salem, a conspicuous outsider. He was Episcopalian in a Puritan community, French-born in an English colony, and considerably richer than most of his neighbors. Wealth and difference were not assets in the Salem of 1692. He and his wife Mary were accused in April of that year. They were arrested separately and eventually held together in Boston. They escaped from custody. The precise circumstances have never been documented, though contemporaries attributed the escape to the assistance of Governor Simon Bradstreet and his wife, and fled to New York, where they remained for several months until the trials ended. His wife Mary died in 1694, at the age of 42. English publicly and repeatedly insisted her death was a direct consequence of the hardships she had suffered during their arrest and imprisonment. He returned to Salem and spent years petitioning the court for compensation for the property and goods that had been seized from him in his absence. Ships, warehouses, personal items, trade goods. He estimated his total losses at more than £1,500. His claims were only partially satisfied. He died in 1736, still pursuing restitution, reportedly refusing at his deathbed to forgive at least one of the men he held responsible, who benefited from what was taken from him and by how much was never the subject of any formal accounting. Number 3. The source of the witch cake. In February 1692, before the first formal accusations were made, a neighbor of the Paris family named Mary Sibley took matters into her own hands. She instructed Tituba and her husband John Indian, both enslaved in the Paris household, to bake what was known as a witch cake, a piece of rye bread mixed with the urine of the afflicted girls, fed to the family dog. The logic, drawn from English folk magic tradition, was that the dog as a familiar spirit would somehow reveal the identity of whoever was tormenting the children. It is the kind of thing that made perfect sense within the belief system of 17th century rural Massachusetts, which blended Puritan theology with older English folk practices, in ways the ministers preferred not to acknowledge. When Reverend Parris discovered what had been done, he was publicly furious, condemning Sibley from the pulpit as someone who had gone to the devil for help against the devil. But the cake had already been baked. The dog had already eaten it. Some historians argue that this act of counter-magic, an ordinary congregation member trying to do something useful, was the moment that transformed the girls' afflictions from a troubling private family matter into a public supernatural crisis requiring official response. Whether the witch cake was truly a turning point or just one of many factors, and how widespread the practice of folk magic actually was in Salem's community, has never been established from surviving records. Number 2. The role of Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather was the most prominent Puritan minister in Massachusetts in 1692, and his involvement in the Salem trials is one of the most debated questions in American colonial history. He did not attend the trials regularly, but his influence on the theology underlying them, his writings on witchcraft, his correspondence with the judges, his public endorsement of the court's work, has led many historians to identify him as a key enabler. He attended the execution of George Burroughs in August 1692, and when the crowd was visibly shaken by Burroughs's flawless recitation of the Lord's Prayer from the gallows, something it was widely believed witches were incapable of doing, Mather addressed the crowd from horseback. He told them the devil was capable of appearing as an angel of light. His intervention helped settle the crowd, and the execution proceeded. Mather wrote Wonders of the Invisible World shortly after, defending the court's proceedings and the evidence it had accepted. His critic Robert Califf responded years later with More Wonders of the Invisible World, accusing Mather of having encouraged and legitimized the hysteria. Mather spent the rest of his life insisting he had acted with caution and integrity. He claimed he had privately expressed reservations about spectral evidence. Whether those private reservations were real, and why he did not express them loudly enough to matter, has never been satisfactorily explained by his voluminous writings. As historian Bernard Rosenthal observed, Mather was a man of his time in the worst possible sense, a description that is both accurate and inadequate. Number 1. Why the hysteria stopped. The Salem witch trials began in February 1692 and were effectively over by October of that year, when Governor William Phips dissolved the court of oyer and terminer that had been conducting the prosecutions. But why the hysteria stopped when it did, after 25 deaths and the imprisonment of over 150 people, has never been fully explained, and the explanations that are offered are less satisfying the more closely you examine them. Several factors are regularly cited. The court had been accepting spectral evidence, testimony in which accusers claimed to see the spirit or specter of the accused tormenting them. And prominent Massachusetts ministers, including Increase Mather, began publicly questioning whether such evidence could be trusted. The logic was straightforward. If the devil could impersonate an innocent person, then seeing someone's specter proved nothing. The accusations had also been escalating in a way that was becoming socially untenable. By the fall of 1692, the accusers were naming people of wealth and standing, including Mary Phips, the wife of the governor. When the powerful began appearing in the dock, the machinery became inconvenient for the people who had been running it. But whether it was self-preservation, genuine moral reconsideration, loss of faith in the evidence, exhaustion, or some combination of all of these that finally ended, it is something the historical record cannot conclusively establish. The people who made the decision to stop left no clear accounting of their reasoning. Governor Phips dissolved the court in a letter that is notably short on explanation. The remaining accused were released, and the community slowly, awkwardly, began the work of pretending it could go back to normal. In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the most prolific and damaging accusers, who had named 62 people, made a public apology read to the congregation of Salem Village. She attributed what had happened to a great delusion of Satan and expressed sorrow for her part in it. She did not explain what had changed between 1692 and 1706. She did not explain why she had been so certain then and was so sorry now. Nobody apparently asked. The community seemed to want the apology more than it wanted the explanation. Salem has always been better at marking its history than at fully accounting for it, which is perhaps the most honest thing you can say about the place. The trials ended, the apologies came, the questions never fully did. And 330 years later, historians are still going back to the same incomplete records, looking for the answer to the same basic question. How did this happen? And could it happen again? The first part of that question remains unresolved. The second part, most historians will tell you quietly, is not really a question. Salem has spent 3 centuries trying to understand what happened in 1692, and that is just the beginning of what this city cannot fully explain. The records are incomplete, the motives are murky, and the people who might have answered these questions took their reasons with them. That is what makes Salem not just a historical curiosity or a Halloween destination, but a genuinely unresolved place with genuinely unresolved questions that historians are still actively working on today. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If you found this interesting, hit that like button and subscribe. There is plenty more left to uncover, and we are just getting started.